I've been taking a break from reading as I've been attached to some books for upwards of sometimes a year, having read Zizek's books very, very slowly because it's extremely challenging and difficult and complex, but also very interested in it in the same reasons, that it's very rich, even if I might not be able to understand most of it. I guess I understand it at this point, particularly when I use guides to get a sense of it, but it doesn't come easy for me. And sometimes I also wonder why I read it, because it's probably a form of self-punishment that I continue to come back to. And on the topic of punishment, I've been playing a game called Silent Hill. And I'm assuming at this point Silent Hill as a franchise has become quite popular, so you might have heard it before. And this particular game that I'm playing is called Silent Hill 2. And while one, I think, focused on the concept of the town, 2 delved into the characters and shifted Silent Hill to a kind of symbolic representation of a certain psychic state that might be understood as a psychological hell, and more so in the ordinary sense. What brings me to this title is, I suppose, my own trauma. I previously played Silent Hill 2 about 10 years ago, if that was when it was released. And at that time, I didn't really carry much psychological attachment to it in a personal level, and mostly kind of observed it in an analytical lens of trauma, and the representation of Silent Hill representation of the main character's trauma as it manifested through the survival through Silent Hill. And yet I'm playing through the remake. At this point, I've traversed through some horrible and incredibly confusing milestones in my life that were chosen, and I also have taken, and I think maybe hold an attraction or an attachment to Silent Hill because of my own history and relationship with psychological issues, both familial and personal, as in family, hereditary, and personal. And so Silent Hill 2 is the story of James Sunderland. He is a man who has received a letter from his dead wife. In his construction of the identity of his wife and his relationship to her, he recognizes or understands, that she ended up dying of a horrible disease of which he feels a victim for such a tragedy to have befallen him. And so that construction of reality motivates him towards a sort of almost fetishistic possibility because of the impossibility of the proposition that she is actually alive toward that goal. And through his traversal of Silent Hill, we start to see a crumbling and unraveling of the world, which becomes a representation of James's psychic apparatus or psychic state, which is revealing to him his own incapacity to hold together the fantasy instead of the truth of his experience. Now, James eventually realizes through the sort of crumbling of Silent Hill from a sort of comfortable, ordinary town to a deteriorated framework of hellish-like environments and creatures, that he ended up killing his wife. So there is a big twist in this. Then the twist is that he is actually the guilty perpetrator and created the sort of psychic bandage of a false story in order to relieve himself of the guilt and responsibility of the death of his wife. What holds him into that, I think, state was that in some cases it was true, and that Mary was dying of a disease of which was causing her, and as a result, consequently, James, mental stress, creating conflict and kind of rupturing the fantasy of the relationship of which we all carry when we're in an attachment to another person. There is the surface level fantasy of which we hold up towards what could become of the relationship and what it should be for us, and that holds us together. And then there's the raw reality of which we have to, or we hopefully learn to accept the reality, who they are actually, which is the messy accident of being a self-aware fragment in the universe, living through something like the reproduction of its own life, which is the human being, and its own systems to maintain that form for fear of the unknown, of which is death. And James ends up becoming deadlocked into the anger or the emotional intensity of the responsibility of living through the rupture of his fantasy of his wife and the life of which he assumed he deserved or desired. And through friction, a reactive response led to him killing his wife. And then through that, leading him to, from what I understand, he probably wrote that letter. He wrote the letter himself to go back to Silent Hill, but it was probably something like the liminal state of experience of which that particle of our experience writes and holds us to continuing to move through something in order to reveal to us something which is elusive and unknown, which is the truth. And as I'm moving through this game, it creates a lot of reflection on my own actions, living through my own kind of Silent Hill. And I don't know how deep I want to go into my own personal story of my becoming, in a sense, but I'm seeing mirrors, of course, and this game is mostly attempting, I'm assuming what it is some sort of placeholder mirror to our own psychological experiences of a life of which we've fantasized or projected outward of how things are supposed to be in order to create linearity and comfort and safety towards particular ends that we desire, say success, happiness, flourishment, opportunity. And yeah, the messy reality that we're living through something that is more akin to chaos and that lacks any meaning and holds indifference to our existence and the existence of others, and having to survive that while also observing others through their own attempts to survive that chaos. And so we have James, his uncovering, while also interrogating, or not even interrogating, I would say observing the lives of Angela. And Angela is a survivor of sexual abuse from her father. And Angela comes to Silent Hill wanting to find her mother. And as somebody who survived abuse as a child, I can hold some attachment or understanding of Angela's case of attempting to resolve a fantasy of, the good childhood being ruptured and destroyed, and having to survive that. But of course, Angela's situation is an intensely traumatic, I suppose, duration of trauma in which it's the subject who has experienced a rupture of the family unit through sexual abuse of a parental figure, and then having to both keep silent about the perpetrator and survive through years, I'm assuming, of violence and abuse without the capacity for the mother, in this case, to do much, which is similar to an author's experience as well that I was talking to about recently in the past year. And then we have, is it Edward? I don't remember what his name is, but there was another character, Eddie. And Eddie is the representation of the social outcast. So the subject who, by virtue of an incapacity to align to the social expectations of beauty and manner, has become both psychologically and I'm assuming socially removed from the world. And he's moving through Silent Hill to survive that, but also psychologically work towards annihilating the other, which becomes any other who represents or triggers him towards the suffering of which he has experienced, and that is bullying and mistreatment and exclusion from the social world. Which in some sense is my own mirror in the same sense. So both Angela and yet, and in this case Eddie, is also a representation of my own experience of attempting to hold up a ideal, I suppose, performative representation of myself to the social world, and my own suffering aligning to that ideal, while recognizing in retrospect that that was never me, even if there is a compulsion within the very sensitive fabric of the social to uphold a certain idea of oneself. But then of course we come to realize that there's a fine division between the social self and the self, the psychological self, and amending and acceptance of those two inconsistent forms that resolves or dissolves in, the compulsion of self-destruction towards becoming the social self, as if the psychological self is lacking in a way that is impossible to recover. So there's all these mirrors in this game, and it's quite difficult, I think, psychologically. It's well done. It's well done in the sense of these mirrors. I think what makes it successful is that it's able to resonate, probably unconsciously, in how people, every person, and this is what every person survives through trauma or survives through their lives, because through milestones of development or becoming, we have to confront the reality object, the external world itself, as well as ourselves. And while we're, when we're very young, we hold up the fantasy that it's consistent and accurate and predictable and safe. And slowly through experience, we start to recognize that the world is chaotic and indifferent, and the world itself is ready, not even ready, but it will harm us and cause us pain and suffering because of that chaos. And how the other, through its own existence simply as awareness, universal awareness of itself, will inflict harm through that awareness, and the incapacity for the universe to align to the social safety nets or the psychic safety nets of continuity, in the means of that people are safe and consistent, that environments are safe and consistent, that psychic states and morals and ethics are safe and consistent, But of course, as we move through this experience, we start to recognize that there's always a gap. Like everything is relatively fractured. There's no smooth surface, and I mean, it becomes, and this is why the inclusion of luck works through, is that our lives is that, like, we don't know what's going to happen, and a series of events might allow us access to a random series of events might allow us access to our own needs and wants, but it's not guaranteed. So luck plays into that card of becoming. And this game, it's haunting. It's not really, I mean, it's enjoyable in the sense that, like, it's progressive, like you can move forward, and it's not frustrating in the sense of that progression, but it's really dark and grimy, and the representations often, they mirror our own mental, it's our own mental challenges, attempting to resolve the chaos of our world through addictions that often come up, and having to work through that painful ego self that is attempting to survive through the realization of its abandonment, in the sense of, like I've been saying, in the fantasy of what it was supposed to be. It's the expectation of how things should be, and I just been working through this game. It's and at this point the tragedy is unfolding, where, I mean, I don't know if it's tragedy, but Maria has died and Maria has come back, but then it's starting to rupture his own fantasy of what Maria was, or Mary was, Mary, his wife, who killed, and and he's, so I would say, as a psychological representation of the human condition through placeholders, as the characters are, as well as the world is, it's a very engrossing psychological experience to move through. I wouldn't say I enjoy it, because it's haunting me, and I've survived through psychosis, I've survived through my own storytelling of survival, and yet also how James was, how he rewrote the story of his life in order to both resolve his capacity to survive, but also, in the same sense, led him to the truth of his being, of his actions. And it's, generally when speaking about Silent Hill, it's a weird project, but it's very interesting on how it approaches subjectivity in the psychic sense.